Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on exploring bias in healthcare, analyzing the diabetes dataset. Our team, Group 6, also known as Los Tigres, consists of Ilona, Laurence, Cornell, Hira, and myself, Tom. In this presentation, we'll be discussing the critical topic of bias in healthcare data, specifically focusing on our analysis of the provided diabetes dataset. Let's walk through our agenda for today's presentation. We begin with introduction and objectives, where we outline what we aim to achieve with this analysis. Next, we'll move into data set exploration. Here, we'll delve into the specifics of the diabetes dataset, discussing its variables, characteristics, and the crucial data cleanup steps we undertook to address identified issues like medically implausible values and omissions. Following that, we'll jump into bias identification and analysis. This section is central to our work, where we detail the potential biases embedded in the data itself and the data collection processes, and discuss their real-world implications. We will also highlight biases stemming from variables that are notably missing from the dataset. Finally, we'll outline bias mitigation strategies that can be implemented to safeguard the integrity and inclusiveness of healthcare research practices. We will conclude with a summary of our findings and the broader ethical considerations. Healthcare research has become highly data intensive, but this process is inherently prone to biases that can impact conclusions and lead to unrepresentative outcomes. To kick us off and explore the data set in detail, I'd like to hand it over to my good friend and teammate, Cornell.
Hello, my name is Cornell Commodore, and it is my pleasure to go over dataset exploration as relates to this assignment, PSET 4 for Group 6. One of the interesting things we noticed as we were looking at the dataset overall was that the diabetes dataset had over 768 patient records. And in looking at that CSV file, we found that there were a lot of factors, variables that would help make it easier for someone as we were doing our analysis to determine if someone had the likelihood of having diabetes based off of various factors. We also looked at variables such as age, blood pressure, pregnancies, and diabetes pedigree function just to evaluate them to see if there were any risks that could be associated to biases due to missing contextual factors. At the end of the day, the goal was measuring that key variable of outcome, which we noticed had a 0 or a 1. And we assume that to mean that 1 means that a person is diabetic or likely diabetic, and 0 meaning someone is non-diabetic or unlikely to be diabetic. We use this as we were evaluating our data sets for training. And then we also took into account various elements such as sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and how its socioeconomic status was absent. And we also kind of took that in context with the different variables that were presented in the data set. Also looking at in the terms of the data overview, just looking at the different variables themselves. We spent some time to try to understand what each variable was. We tried to define it from a clinical context due to some of our research. And then we also wanted to understand as we started analyzing this using various notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, what the data types were for each of the variables. And then we also wanted to kind of categorize everything in terms of its medical history, if it's biological, in terms of its categorization, is it something that's clinical? So we went through each and every one of the variables. For example, for pregnancies, glucose, blood pressure, and skin thickness and insulin, we determined that out of those variables, that they are integers and that each of the variable field categories had a specific purpose. This sets up the next important component that we wanted to do, which was exploratory data analysis, to make sure that as we looked at this data as a whole, we were able to see how each feature related in a way to identify potential sources of bias as it relates to diabetes prediction and then making sure if there's any missing context as far as things that could cause unequal representation that can affect fairness in the data. In doing that, one of the first steps that we did was conducted a correlation matrix with this data. So we wanted to explore how each of these variables in the data set could relate to one another. And looking at the chart and the analysis that we did in Python, we determined that valuable values that were close to 1 indicated a strong positive correlation, and values near -1 indicated a strong negative correlation. And then any cases where you may see a 0 or something close to 0 indicated a little or no linear relationship. Out of that analysis, some of the key observations that we noticed was that glucose had the strongest positive correlation with diabetes outcome, followed by BMI, which indicated to us that those were key predictors for this data set. And then when we look at other things such as diabetes pedigree function and insulin, they showed some weaker associations, but we also wanted to make sure that as we did our analysis that it highlighted the need for careful feature selection during data modeling. Some of the key things we had to keep in account when we were analyzing the data were some of the data quality challenges that we would encounter. So several variables we noticed as we scanned the data set contained medically implausible zero values. One of our first methods was to ensure that we removed those values and made sure that we could prevent the need for these values to cause biased results and misleading conclusions. Right off the bat, we identified that blood pressure values that had 0 were physiologically impossible, and those rows or those entries and cases of that in the data needed to be removed. We also looked at BMI and also glucose as potential candidates for rows and values that may need to be removed, which we will get into in future sections.
All right. So given the data quality issues, the next step was obviously data cleaning, which was critical to safeguard the integrity of any analysis done from the data. So specifically, the steps we took were first to assign unique patient IDs to be able to track what patients have what data. And then we identified and excluded data points which were seen as errors. In this case, more specifically, we dealt with what we read as unmeasured values, which were showing as 0, replacing them with NAs. And for this data set specifically, we didn't include anything else, although we could exclude outliers. We didn't do that given we are not medical experts. And this specifically impacted the glucose, blood pressure, skin thickness, and BMI, where we excluded the zeros, whereas other variables like insulin or DPF, we understand they could be 0, or in the case of DPS, we didn't observe any zeros, and so there was no change there. And once we had the cleaned data, we then, as a next step, did some predictive analysis. Now, although the purpose of this assignment was not predictive analysis, we thought it was important to do some predictive analysis using the data, which would then serve as a perfect segue or foundation to showcase the bias that is inherent in the data and that how that impacts the use of the data. So in order to do this, we picked the outcome, the diabetes binary outcome, as the dependent variable and used all the 8 independent variables as independent inputs. And then we selected a linear regression using the ordinary least squares and a logistic regression using the logit model. We did both univariate and multivariate regressions. The OLS, of course, is the workhorse of practitioners and can be applied to binary dependent variables as a linear probabilistic model. And because it's binary, of course, even though not as easy to interpret as the OLS, the logit also served as an important secondary model. And based on these models, we analyze what variables are best used as predictors of the diabetes outcome. And what we saw was, excuse me, both the univariate and multivariate analysis on the OLS and the logit indicated that glucose is the most distinct predictor of diabetes, followed by BMI, which is also a good predictor. pregnancies, and DPF also serve as reasonable predictors for the diabetes outcome. Now, in this context, we define reasonableness as both statistically significant as well as the strength and weight of the coefficient in how that impacts the outcome. And so this then becomes a perfect segue to discuss bias, which impacts or is embedded in pretty much most, if not all, of these variables. And that is what we'll see next.
When we talk about bias in healthcare data, we're talking about who gets seen, who gets overlooked, and who is misrepresented. Bias in a dataset doesn't just affect model performance, it shapes real outcomes for real patients. Some of those biases come from the variables that are already present. For instance, the dataset is dominated by middle-aged patients, while younger and older individuals are significantly underrepresented. That imbalance limits the model's ability to generalize and risks overlooking entire age groups with meaningful health risks. Some variables raise issues because they're used without enough context. Take pregnancies. It's highly relevant for identifying gestational diabetes, but in this dataset, it appears without any associated sex or gender data. That makes it difficult for the model to know when the feature is meaningful and when it could actually introduce error. For example, by applying pregnancy-related patterns to patients for whom it's biologically inapplicable. Access to measurement is another issue. Lab values like insulin or glucose are critical, but not every patient has equal access to testing. These gaps aren't just missing values, they're reflections of broader healthcare disparities. If not handled properly, they quietly bias the model against patients from lower resource environments. Even the features that seem routine, like BMI or blood pressure, aren't as neutral as they appear. These measures don't carry the same clinical meaning across racial or ethnic groups. Yet, when a model uses them without adjustment, it can produce unequal, even inaccurate risk predictions. Some biases are more subtle. The dataset includes a variable based on family history, the diabetes pedigree function, but it assumes everyone has access to detailed generational health information. That's rarely the case for patients from immigrant communities, low literacy populations, or under-resourced systems. What looks like a clean input may actually reflect privilege more than health. This dataset has no information on sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or geographic location, variables that are foundational to understanding health risks, outcome, and disparities. Without them, we can't evaluate fairness. We can't compare accuracy across different groups. We cannot identify whether the model works equally well for everyone or disproportionately fails some without us knowing. For example, if race or ethnicity isn't included, we can't assess whether the model underperforms for historically marginalized communities or whether it's reinforcing diagnostic patterns that already reflect systemic inequities in care. It also limits how we interpret the predictions themselves. In the absence of these variables, a lower risk score might say less about the patient's actual condition and more about the healthcare they had access to. This is especially true when socioeconomic status is missing. A patient might appear low risk, not because they're healthy, but because limited access to diagnosis means there's simply less information in the system about them. And if that's the case, the model isn't predicting health, it's predicting access. There are broader consequences too. When entire populations are excluded from data collection, it sends a clear message that their experiences aren't part of the system. Over time, this exclusion erodes trust, discourages engagement with healthcare tools, and makes future interventions harder to implement, particularly in communities already underserved.
Hi, everyone. This is slide 19 on the bias mitigation strategy. We propose the following mitigation strategy to minimize the biases outlined in the previous section. Taken together, the following 6 mitigation strategies offer a roadmap for improving outcomes analysis and interpretability. None of the mitigation strategies involve major technical complexity, but all rely on deliberate planning, transparent documentation, and inclusive data design.
In conclusion, our analysis of the diabetes dataset underscores that the quality of any data-driven predictive model fundamentally depends on the quality of its underlying data. The biases, errors, and omissions we identified significantly limit the validity of any statistical analysis. These issues, such as inconsistent definitions, incomplete reporting, and especially missing critical demographic information, are common challenges in real-world health data. Without appropriate corrections, these shortcomings can reinforce existing health disparities. From an ethical standpoint, excluding marginalized populations undermines both scientific integrity and public health impact. A utilitarian perspective highlights that such exclusion prevents maximizing overall societal benefit, while a Kantian perspective notes it fails to respect inherent dignity and equitable treatment, perpetuating disparities. Therefore, clinical research must actively mandate the fair inclusion of underrepresented populations to prevent reinforcing structural inequalities. Our work echoes critical historical lessons such as Tuskegee syphilis study, which serves as a stark reminder of the profound harm inflicted by failing to uphold ethical standards in medical research. We hope our presentation has provided valuable insights into addressing bias in healthcare data. To further explore these concepts and interact with a tool that relies on similar data principles, we invite you to explore DiabRisk, an interactive risk assessment tool we've developed that utilizes elements of the diabetes dataset. You can access it via the URL or QR code displayed below. Thank you for your time and attention.
Diabetes file 758 million watts, lives we found. Each variable's measured on important medical grounds. But look close at the readings. A problem took hold. Those fans at zero values. A story untold. Blood pressure, skin thickness, insulin, BMI, so why 49% insulin, zero, where can the truth hide? A living body's BMI can never be zero, you know. You know, garbage in, garbage out, more reliable models to grow. So we cleaned out the errors, set ranges so clear, replaced with and banishing all data fear. From faulty zero values to data's honest light, we seek model reliability for too strong and bright. Biases uncovered in every data line, we find quality data, ethical models benefiting humankind. Then we looked at the dataset, beyond the numbers on the page. Missing sex, missing race, turning a critical stage. No ethnicity, no income, no geography, no trace. How can our predictions truly serve every case? Pregnancies without gender or bias so stark. A model for men just hit in the heart.